Welcome, everybody, to Smarter. I'm your host, Jess Elmquist, and I have a great guest today. As you know, Smarter is really about leadership. It's about trends in the marketplace, and it's really about talent. And it's an opportunity for all of us to get smarter together. My guest is a good friend, a CFO at Phenom, a company that I actually work on as well, Davinder Athwal. Hey, Davinder, how are you? Thanks for being here today.
Hey, Jess, real pleasure to be here with you today. And I've been really looking forward to this podcast. I've seen some of the work you do. It's fantastic. I'm glad to be a part of it.
Yeah, we've been talking about this for a while, and we've got some great episodes that we've already put, out into the world. And I think this is perfect timing, not only for you and I to be able to connect, but also to really engage with a CFO that has his finger on the pulse of what's happening in the marketplace, but also a talent forward thinking CFO. I'm excited to dig into that. But before we do that, I think it would be great to be able to hear a little bit about your backstory and kind of introduce yourself to our listeners and your journey to the position that you're in today.
Yeah, happy to share that with you. So I began my career with PwC out in Silicon Valley, I think mid-1990s, and helping take a number of companies public. Some of my clients were Yahoo, eBay, Netflix, as well as a whole bunch of others that have since been acquired or merged or just like basically fallen by the wayside. That just seems to be the nature of the industry that we're in. What I've learned about myself is that I'm really attracted to disruptive companies that are trying to make a difference. And I'll start by saying that, my journey to Phenom was actually unexpected. I wasn't looking for a new job when I was contacted about the CFO role here. And to be honest, the only reason I took the call from the recruiter was because I was really intrigued about the fact that there's a venture-backed, high-growth software startup in Philly. And it just doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, not a hotbed for startups in technology, for sure.
We're going to change that, but it hasn't been the case historically. That's very true.
Yeah.
So I really came out to meet, with the folks out here, really out of curiosity, just to kind of network and get to know them. But I'll say, Jess, after meeting Mahi, for that first time and understanding how Phenom is trying to help 1 billion people find the right job, I just knew this is where I belonged. That meeting was even more powerful, after I got home that night and began to really think about, the fact that, we're all surrounded by people who we know personally who, for whatever reason, are just not in the right job, and how it's affected them and their families and like just their aspirations about, around life and things like that. And in my case, the realization was it's my dad, was a great example of that. Just to kind of backtrack a little bit here. So my parents emigrated to the UK from India in the mid-1960s. And in India, my dad was a military engineer in an emerging field at the time around electronics communication. And as he was preparing to transition to civilian life, what he found was that he was in really hot demand by local regional tech companies who were literally tripping over each other to hire him. And he assumed that this same dynamic would be true once he got to the UK. Unfortunately for my dad, that's not how things played out. In the UK, he couldn't even get a response to like the countless applications that he had made. And you kind of sit back and you wonder, well, what could have caused that? What was it that the technology that he was using in India was that radically different from the UK? Hard to believe, really, because most of it came from the UK and the USA.
Yeah.
Right. So that couldn't have been it. Actually, the more likely reason is that employers were using proxies to assess his skills and suitability for the work that they needed to get done. And unfortunately for my dad, he just didn't go to the right school or a school that they recognized. Didn't work for a company that they recognized or have a brand behind him. And on top of all of that, most Indians at the time in the UK were manual factory workers who either didn't speak English or if they did, had a very odd accent. In short, he just was not a normal candidate for the kind of jobs that he was looking for. So, as I thought about that, he really is the reason I joined Phenom's mission to help 1 billion people find the right job because, I know, and I'm sure my dad knows this, that the right job for him is actually doing what he was trained to do for many, many years, loved to do, and had done for, a number of years at such a highly proficient level that you could say that people's lives literally depended upon it. If only he was assessed on his actual skills and not some tenuous proxies that are in reality extremely poor indicator of success, life could have been very different for him. And as a result of that, very different for me. But, that's the short journey to, or the thumb that how it got to Phenom.
Well, it sounds like, not only you're prepared vocationally, but you really actually had more of a heartstring that got plucked here at Phenom. And, it's really interesting. I appreciate you actually sharing that personal story about your dad's journey because there is so much of what Phenom's about. And, my journey to Phenom was a little irregular too as the CHRO here. because I was a customer for 9 years. And one of the things that I found that Phenom did with the 20,000 people that my company hired annually is that it diminished that familiarity bias or some of those other pieces that can really impact. It could be intentional or unintentional, right? An unconscious thing that people are making decisions, but it can be a real turning point for people vocationally. And so I think it is a piece of the purpose of helping 1 billion people find the right job. It's that the right job is the key. And that's what I'm hearing from you too. It's like you can find a job, but finding that right job that really hits all of the markers is important. And it sure sounds like, from your journey professionally, you've had some great opportunities. Like you were in kind of the hotbed of training financial minds, PwC, and some of the big consultative organizations. You get to dip into a lot of different places there. Did you find that those early opportunities to kind of have a broad impact across a lot of organizations helped you hone your skill as you focused in and became CFO of several different companies over the last couple decades?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would say that I was blessed to be able to get the job at PwC, particularly at a time when this part of the market was just like literally taking off, right? So think about, again, mid-90s, Silicon Valley, just a lot of excitement about changing the world and the kind of companies that were coming out of that era. And I was, basically I started out at the lowest, kind of, role you could do, which was actually playing bagels for folks who are like doing all the kind of manual work, right? But even that had its value, Jess, and it really taught me the value of kind of sticking it out, persevering, helping the team, right? So there's a lot of lessons learned along the way, that aren't like directly hard technical skills, but just like how to approach things, how to approach people, how to approach situations, like what's my role? How do I kind of sometimes be a leader? How do I sometimes be a team member? All these kind of things that are like really, I would say, kind of soft skills or, things that you don't pick up in a spreadsheet or you don't pick up in school, absolutely were a big part of the training. Then, along with that, I was like fortunate to have, worked alongside some really, really talented founders and other people that were running these companies and just kind of being able to tap into their mindset. And I would say, along that entire journey, kind of having, that benefit, having done a lot of hard work, really has kind of brought me to where I am. And I kind of look back, I would say every single day, at every one of my jobs that I've had in the past, and like those formative years in particular, and there is always something I can draw on, in terms of, what I'm doing today, from those days.
Yeah, no, I think that's important for a lot of the leaders and aspiring leaders that listen to Smarter. I think we can see people in their roles today and not realize that there was a bagel buying role at one point or another where you had to actually earn your keep. You had to kind of earn your stripes and be able to figure out how to persevere. I think perseverance is a really important skill. And we're going to talk a little bit about change a little later on. And when I think about being in a world of constant and continuous change, perseverance becomes a really important trait of any organization, but any individual that wants to either lead self, lead process, or lead other people. So I think that's actually a great kind of beginning journey piece. So I think the other piece, though, too, is I'm kind of glad that we had talked about getting you on the podcast until now, because, just recently, some congratulations are in order because you were named the CFO of the Year by the Philadelphia Business Journal. And so congratulations. And in some ways, I wanted to mention that now because it feels a bit like one of those capstones, right? From this PwC entry-level analyst role to being a CFO who's been recognized amongst his peers as someone who's doing something pretty outstanding. Congratulations, first of all. But tell us a little bit about kind of that journey and that surprise of getting that award and recognition.
Yeah, well, hey, look, first of all, thanks. Really appreciate the warm congrats there, Jess. It's a great honor. It really is to be recognized, by your peers, by experts, as being one of the best, right? And we're in a market here in Philly where there is no shortage of exceptional finance leaders,
great companies,
and talent. Right?
No
It's
doubt.
a who's who, right? So to be recognized among that group, it really does feel extra special to have that honor. And look, I'd also be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to my team here at Phenom who make all this possible, right? Because I do rely on them to kind of basically keep me as effective as I can be. But look, it was a surprise to me. Jesse, when I heard about this, it was not something that I was canvassing for or campaigning for. This is one of these what I would call a real award, right? This isn't something that you can pay for
Right.
and kind of get to participate in it. But this is something that happens kind of really behind the scenes. My understanding is the way this works is someone must have nominated me, and then there's got to be other people that second it, and they do some of their own sleuthing around kind of around my background and people around my circle to kind of come up with this. But it is great. Look, there's maybe about 20 of us, I think, that got recognized this year. And I got a chance to meet some of them. They're all like super business people, kind of like the kind of CFOs that I would want to be, sparring to if I was new,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
around, people first, really around very high business acumen. None of these guys are your bean counter types, that are kind of back office and shrinking, kind of violets and things like that. So I
Yeah.
feel like I'm
Well,
in good company, with
yeah,
this
for
list.
sure. That's actually a really good point because one of the bullets I wanted to have us talk a little bit about, because we've actually chatted about it in the past, is that there's really been a transition of almost like a new mindset of the CFO, and I can't help but see the famous Philadelphia sculpture in a frame behind you, the love sculpture. But there seems to be less of a bean counter, although that's critical. Those are critical basic skills that every CFO needs to have, is the ability to manage and take care of the P&L. But there almost seems to be an elevated sense that CFOs are more involved across the broad range of business, including the soft skills, like never before. So you would consider yourself, and even some of these other people that have been awarded this great recognition in Philly, as almost a different era of CFO, if I can actually put that on and kind of respond to that. What do you think about that?
Well, look, Jess, I think it's certainly true that your traditional CFO, maybe even most CFOs for that matter, are preoccupied, right, with things like the economy, competitor threats, profits, cash flows,
Yeah.
structure of organizations, all that kind of stuff. That's really important, by the way. I don't mean to minimize any of that. That's really table stakes.
No, it's almost a
Uh,
both and, right? But you're
it really,
talking about
yeah,
the and now. Yeah.
absolutely. I was going to say, but the end here is that at the same time, we know that enterprise value is created by producing a product, service, and experience, whatever your company does,
Right.
that customers are going to love, right? And we all know that, in these days, having a merely satisfied customer, it's not enough anymore. A satisfied customer, there's no greater chance than to come back and do business with you or talk to you about, what's on their mind or what they're really missing, or, make them loyal to the brand. But when they love you and when they love the whole experience of working with you, that's kind of, where the payoff really comes from. And I would say that in order to create that experience, for customers in a meaningful way, in a sustainable way over time, you've got to create a culture or an environment people love working in. It goes back to the thing behind my
Yeah.
on my wall
Yeah.
here, right? Because if I don't love working here, it's much more difficult for me to create products and services that my customers are going to love. And if I don't love what I'm doing here and love the people I'm around and doing it with, and then the folks that we're doing it for, like I'm faking it, right? I can kind of like dial it in.
Yeah.
Or phone it in, right? But look, people are pretty good. They're astute. They sense that pretty quickly. And if they sense that you're pretending and you're not really, kind of invested, like we've all been to the dry cleaners, right? Where you get those hanger things,
Yeah.
they've got
Yeah.
that, we are our customers, right? But do you really believe that every single time? No, that kind of stuff is easy to do, right? I'm having
Right.
logos and the
Right.
kind of talking points are easy. But what I'm talking about, Jess, it's an imperative. I mean, this is not a nice to have. This is an imperative that you've really got to bring into kind of your thinking, into your day-to-day, really into your strategic plan in a way, because it actually it directly affects results, right? Which we would call the bottom line. So in a kind of a in a
Yeah.
snapshot, that's how that love journey for
Yep.
me brings it
Yep.
back around.
Well, and I think I'll just call it out. We have a CFO on Smarter, and we've been talking for 5 minutes about love. And I do think that that is kind of one of those elemental shifts of we still need to be able to actually think about the small, predictable, controllable, incremental pieces of the business every single day. We need to be able to have accountabilities to hitting goals and expectations. But you don't have to just do that. You can actually do both, especially if it's truly who you are, right? So every breath, inhale and exhale is one that actually cares, is elevated, and maybe aware of the people around us, not just as cogs in a wheel, but actually people who are trying to transform their own lives. And I also think too that Davinder, I'd love you to speak to this, but I also think that it's really critical for people in positional authority, right? When you have a C in front of your title, right? You're part of that C-suite. How you act and how you manage to that type of kind of emotional quotient that we're talking about, people see through it faster or they authenticate it faster. Like you can't hide, and people will, they're always queuing in off of that, even if you're a little bit more remote as an organization, because, obviously Phenom has people all over the globe. People key into that. Would you say that that's true? That if you're going to take a position of authority, you better be really aware that people are going to cue in on you, and it matters who you are and how you think and treat others.
No, without question. Look, we talked earlier on about my journey, from bagel buying to where I am, and along that way, one of the most profound lessons, I guess I could say, that I learned was exactly that, Jess, which is just given, the position that you have, whether it's your title or where you're on the org chart, never really mattered to me from the perspective of I want to rise up the org chart, right? But once I began rising up it, I realized that certain roles carry a lot of weight. People
Yeah.
actually do pay more attention. They listen to you, and that they maybe have more than listen to you. They actually look at how you behave and how you conduct yourself and how you act. So it became a really, good lessons for me around kind of making sure that I was kind of, homing in on that kind of feeling. And it comes back down to, really, I would say empathy, right? Because, in most, I would say businesses, what ends up happening is you get kind of the leadership folks that are, kind of off doing the strategic stuff. You got the bulk of the organization trying to execute, and there's not always a good connection between the two, right?
Right.
So you've got these folks that are like trying to do their best work, quite frankly. It's like they giving it all. They're trying to make sense of what they perceive to be the challenges, what they perceive to be the direction, and they're working really hard at that. But if you don't have that connection, with the strategy piece of it, they could be driving or rowing in the wrong kind of direction, if you will.
Right.
So that kind of connection to me became really important because I found that folks really like thirsty, they're hungering for the knowledge about where are we going, why are we going there, how are we going to get there, are we going to get there, right? So you end up becoming not only the guy that or gal that basically lays out the vision, but you also become like the chief storyteller, if you will, about
Yeah.
what the promised land looks like. You end up becoming the person that's basically going to be the coach, right? Like how do you get there, and how do you kind of cover up kind of setbacks and things like that. And a lot of times you become the therapist, right? Because things don't always go to plan, and you got to be able to kind of get people back on their feet and not take it personally, and be able to kind of get up and try it all over again.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a great perspective, and especially again from a CFO, because we are seeing a big transition. I think with CFOs being more incrementally important, not only for just the CEO and the C-suite to direct the financial strategy, but really being a strategy leader. I love the idea of a storyteller inside of that role. And if we think about leadership in the world of finance, let's walk into that. And one of the things that we talked about early on is this whole idea of being able to manage and work through change, and how it used to be a nice to have, but today it's an imperative to be able to be a change leader. And then I think one of the things I'm hearing from you, and we've also you've mentioned before, is being able to actually be adept at navigating uncertainty, creating optionality. Talk to me a little bit about the importance of, I think that's where you could, as a CFO and a leader, when the pressure is on and margins get tight, that's when you can abandon love, abandon empathy, abandon all those soft skills, and just go back down into that kind of bean counter mentality. How do you actually navigate uncertainty and create optionality and hold the organization accountable? Talk a little bit about leadership and holding on to both those inside the real world of pressure and those situations, especially when change is afoot always.
Yeah, look, and certainly since the pandemic, if there's one thing we've learned, it's that certainly change is not only constant, but it's actually more rapid, and the
Yeah.
velocity is much higher than it's ever been. So and I would say these days, we used to talk about adapting to and managing change as a competitive advantage for business. This kind of goes back to its table stakes, right? It's not
Yeah.
about a competitive advantage. It's about that's just a basic requirement for survival, right? I would say in these days. But you hit on a really a number of really key things there, Jess. I'd like to kind of like double click on, a few of those if I may.
Please.
Just starting with like leadership, right? I think what you're already asking about is what does leadership look like, in the eyes of finance or a CFO. And I would say for me, finance leadership is really all about what you just said, right? It's about navigating uncertainty. It's about creating optionality. And I would liken this like great chess players, right? So finance leaders have to go beyond being linear thinkers, just focused on the next step to capture a pawn or a bishop on the board, to being strategic thinkers who plan multiple moves ahead and perhaps even kind of begin to prompt reaction from other constituencies, right? I mean, that to me is the epitome of leadership in finances, where you're actually doing it, where you're playing, chess, not checkers anymore,
Yeah,
and to get
exactly.
the
Yeah.
organization to kind of like lift up and start playing, the game of chess, because that's how we all win. But what does that look like? What was one of your questions? Well, look, finance has always kind of been lucky in a way that we've had a place at the table by virtue of controlling the profit and loss statement, right? And if you think about that statement, it really is kind of the be all and end all a lot of ways, right? It's a comprehensive ledger of like everything that the firm does. There's probably very few people, if any, that have equivalent access or control over this tool. And what I've learned over time, what I would say is that, really good finance leaders, what they excel at is taking that P&L data, that's compiled every month, and then infusing it with real-time information from within and outside the enterprise, analyzing it, synthesizing it, converting it into a competitive asset, which you might call kind of new intelligence, right? So now you know something that you didn't know before, and that's what a really good, finance leader would do. A great finance leader, on the other hand, would take that intelligence and create actionable plans based on where the organization needs to go to meet its objectives. And then you go and you sell this to the business, right? So I've been asked, over the last couple of years, like, what's the most surprising thing that I do as a CFO? And I say, I find myself selling a lot. Not selling our software, but actually selling ideas, selling, kind of what the future of the business to investors, employees, whoever it might be. But it becomes really important to kind of take that intelligence that we may have gained, through the P&L work and synthesizing other data with it, and then basically think of what does this mean to our objectives, right? Can I do something about this to either manage the risk or the downside risk in our plan? Is there any waste that I can reduce or eliminate, because every dollar that gets wasted is a dollar less that I have available to invest in kind of where it really counts the most in terms of getting our objectives met. And maybe most crucially, the key thing, and you just said this, Jess, is a really great CFO, they can do all that, they can sell those ideas, but then they've got a loop back mechanism to make sure that once people sign up on that plan, that they're actually being held accountable for it. And there's a way to do that, right? You don't have to be nasty about this. You don't have to kind of basically bring the stick out every time. But being able to work collaboratively with people, you can kind of get that out, that kind of outcome out of it.
Well, it seems to me too, though, that when the pressure's on, what I hear you saying, though, when the pressure is on and we're asking for a little bit more from people, or we're asking them to make some very hard decisions, don't just turn on the communication then. If you've had constant and consistent caring communication, clear storytelling, helping people see where the promised land can be, but that's happening on a regular basis, when you have to react quickly, when you have to have the organization make hard calls, they actually have that reserve of goodwill for you. And then you're able to actually ask for that withdrawal when the times get tough. I mean, that's how I hear you get the narrative. And I don't know if you're a sci-fi guy at all, Davinder. Some of our listeners, I'm sure, are. But Star Trek had four-dimensional chess, right? It was like it's layered on top of itself, and you're playing through the boards, not even on a single board. And it almost feels like post-pandemic, our world with supply chain and financial issues and crises and things like that, it really feels like that's the case. And I think it's so intriguing because I've not heard a lot of CFOs use storytelling as a key component or leadership trait of their role. I think they've used the fact that they've had access to the P&L at a level that most people don't. And I don't mean it to be demeaning to CFOs by any stretch, but almost like a club. Like, I know something you don't know. Because of that, you're going to do what I tell you to do, and that's it, right? And then we're going to get to that goal. And at what price, right? Because now you have to actually ask for that group January 1st, the next fiscal year, to step up and be re-energized. But you just have bullied them to the goal. And that's, I think, the traditional stigma, whether it's a shared service of HR in my world or shared service, internal G&A service of finance. that's not a way to actually create that love and that passion and that energy in a constant and continuous changing world. Especially when talent has a little bit more of the upper hand today. I love your belief, and I've seen that in action around a both and. That's a big takeaway I hope our listeners have today is this both and of doing the hard work of a job every day, but also keeping that care, concern, and interest in others vitally a part of who you are and what you do as a leader.
Yeah, if I can just maybe, just pull that thread a little bit more, Jess, right? So, there's a couple of things, right? You're right. Look, we've all been around finance people that have basically said, look, you know what? I've got an information advantage. I can't share it with you, but you got to do what I tell you to do, right? I mean, we've all seen those folks, right?
Yep.
And there's a couple of big problems with that, right? Number one is, at least the way I look at this, right, is if I was to do that to the business, I've taken away their ownership as well as anything else, right? So now I own the problem, right?
Mm,
So if things don't go to plan, it's now I own it, right? And I don't want to own problems, Maybe some people want to own successes more than they want to own problems, whatever it is, right? But it starts like putting the ownership where it belongs, right? Because it's not me that actually moves the business forward. I'm just the guy that kind of like shines the light, maybe where there's some lack of sunlight, but that ownership is really critical. But the other
yeah.
part that I'd like double click on is what you said around basically going back to the well, if you will, and the fact that you got to kind of get this done beforehand, because I think what we're talking about is trust, right? Because if you only go to people when you need something, there's going to be a little bit of apprehension about or some skepticism about why you're asking, right? If that's the only time they ever see you. Whereas if you kind of take the time to build the relationships in advance, you're transparent about what you're trying to do to the extent that you can be. You give them ownership. You draw them in. With the storytelling and with kind of the vision for where you're going. That's the better way to do it, right? Because I don't want to have the entire business kind of concentrated in me. I've got to have it really dispersed to where it belongs, right? And that ownership has to be where it belongs. But that's maybe another way to think about, kind of why it's important to be able to,
Yeah.
kind of do this a different way to what we've seen historically.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think about the whole stat, and the research is really clear, is that when you have an engaged employee who feels seen and heard and empowered to do their work, their discretionary effort is more available. And not only when you ask for the extra mile, they're not giving it to you because you're asking for it. They're giving it to you because it's theirs to give. And they willingly do that because of that long-term investment of over time. I have learned that I can trust this person and this role and the request that they're asking, even though maybe what they're asking is really, really hard. And that really brings us to kind of maybe more of a global, but also kind of a phenom, a focused conversation in leadership, because it's again around people. And we work at Phenom, obviously helping 1 billion people get the right job with an AI-empowered, intelligent talent experience platform. We're selling across the globe and servicing really big companies to do some amazing work, because we can never hire 1 billion people on our own. We're going to do that through serving customers that love us. And I love how you made that point earlier. But when we think about turnover, whether it's at Phenom or any other company, Gallup did some research that talked about kind of voluntary churn costs the global marketplace $1 trillion. And some of that's hard cost. Some of that is certainly soft cost. But they also further report that 15% of employees worldwide are engaged at work, only 15%. 51% of employees are currently actively looking for new jobs. So talk a little bit about that financial impact of organizations that may not be focused on that long-term continuous dripping of care and engagement and value and investing in their people when you have this churn and this revolving door happening in your org. As a CFO, how do you see that? And is that something that feels real to you at the P&L level?
Well, just $1 trillion. I mean, that is, it's an astounding number, right? I'm not even sure how many zeros go in that, but it's a big number. But you're right. That is how much U.S. business is, and it's just U.S., not even global.
That's
US
right. I think you're right. It is U.S.
Yeah, right. Or, losing every single year just due to voluntary churn. But look, at some point, that's a really abstract kind of a concept, right? So let me break it down, right, in terms of like what it really means in a more digestible example, if I can. So if you think about average churn across all businesses, right, is about 26%, according to the same statistics that came out with $1 trillion, right? So on average, you're going to be kind of churning 26, or let's say a quarter of your workforce every year, right? And by most estimates, the cost of replacing an employee ranges anywhere from like a half to 2 times annual salary. So if you think about a company with just 100 employees who might make on average $50,000 a year, right, which isn't out of the ordinary these days at all, the cost of churn for that business is somewhere between $660,000 and $2.6 million every single year. Right now, if you're running a business with 100 employees and you're losing maybe $2.5 million a year, that's pretty big, right?
Yeah.
So that's what the hard cost looks like. Now, of course, there's many other costs that don't even kind of register on the spreadsheet. Just think about losing your best problem solvers and the impact that has, your most innovative thinkers, your most reliable winners, right? And then think about the impact on the team that gets left behind, right? Because they've lost like some of the best caliber staff that they were working with, or on your customers, right? Customers, we know, again, think about, love and how certain customers get accustomed to working with certain folks at the
Yeah.
business. If they're
And they're no
gone,
longer here.
right,
Right.
exactly. It becomes a huge problem, right? And maybe even depending on like, who's leaving and where they're leaving and things like that, you're going to certainly jeopardize your brand, but you may even like find yourself like in a litigation situation because someone did something wrong or did something inappropriate. So the costs are like, even way beyond, I would say, the $1 trillion of just the hard cost. But to your point about, from the CFO's role, what I find even more astounding than the $1 trillion number is that most of this damage is actually self-inflicted and actually can be avoided, right? Survey after survey will report that over half of exiting employees in every survey they take say that one of the reasons they're leaving is because in the 3 months before they quit, neither the manager, another leader, nobody at the business of any kind of authority spoke to them about their job satisfaction or their future.
And that, Davinder, that's right back to what you were talking about when you're only talking to people when you need something from them. And it only
Yes.
is transactional. And it doesn't get into that personal side or that development side. You are going to lose track of people and they're going to know they don't feel like you care. So that's actually that stat brings it right back to the point you made earlier. I think that's really fantastic.
Yeah, and it is all connected. Absolutely right. But think about that for a moment, Jeff. Right. So like in over 3 months, no one's asked these folks like how they feel about their job. And nobody spoke to them about their future at the company. So if you're the employee, it's not a wild leap, to say, well, maybe they don't care about me, maybe I don't have a future here, and I start looking elsewhere, right? And just to really compound things now, for businesses, now we've been hearing about the war for talent for a number of decades now, right? But it would appear at this point in time that battle is over and talent has won,
Yeah.
right? And in many cases, that balance of power has shifted. I think, probably irreversibly for a good part from the employer to the employee. And if you think about this environment, what it takes, you can't be thinking about making marginal improvements to employee engagement. We all have seen those surveys and things like that. That's not going to be enough, right? I mean, I think at
No.
this point, it's our job as business leaders, to figure out a plan, like how are we going to create an irresistible organization, that engages employees as kind of sensitive, passionate, creative creators that they love to come to work at. Again, comes back to the same idea.
Yeah, no, I think that actually brings it home. I think in the sense of really kind of how you even found Phenom and how it just fits so much of what you understand. Because I also have found that when I've worked with CFOs or I've talked to CFOs at conferences, oftentimes some of those soft skills, soft losses, right? The things that are really hard to put against a P&L, institutional knowledge, productivity, loss in consumer loyalty based on someone leaving that they really appreciated. CFOs can sometimes diminish some of those true costs. And I don't hear you doing that. I hear you kind of keeping it all in whole. And do you think that's a part of one of those new muscles that CFOs today need to flex harder because there is such a trend or such a shift in the power dynamic around talent having a lot more authority inside of the talent pool than the actual corporations that are hiring them today?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, I think if you went back, 20, 30 years, and look, I deal with information, right? Like all CFOs, we deal with information, right? But if you go back 20, 30 years, that information would have been financial data, right? I mean, that's kind of where the office of the CFO really kind of grew from. And interestingly, you had a lot of folks that were accounting backgrounds, back in those days, and that was it, right? I mean, the data kind of spoke for itself, the dollars kind of spoke for themselves. But I would say, as businesses and business models have transformed, excuse me, from kind of the old, call it the manufacturing, tangible production and things like that, into this new world of, what we're creating is intangible. It may be a service. It may be something that's not even something we charge for, right? Think about, Meta or Google, one of those companies. That have really shifted the landscape so much that, that P&L based on just dollars and, inventory and raw materials, it just doesn't capture, kind of what's really going on in the business.
Yeah.
So, what I think really good CFOs have to do today is they've got to supplement, the hard dollar data with all this other information and all this other intelligence. And it goes back to things like, well, how are our employees feeling? And I do a weekly meeting with our HR folks, and one of the things I keep asking is like, what does our attrition look like, right? And then I want to get insights into why that's happening. So that's an example I think of. I've got to get ahead of that because by the
Yeah.
time it shows up on a P&L, it's too late. It's already happened, right?
Right.
The only way I can really impact next month's P&L is going to be by doing things and looking at leading indicators to be able to kind of make the changes that we need to make now so that the next report looks more to what we want it to see.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a fantastic, I think, partnership with the HR team, meeting with you on a regular basis, and also being able to get sightline to the strategies that HR is employing. That actually brings me to kind of a big question as we kind of taper into kind of the final few minutes of our time together around. You talked about it early. CFOs have had, based on the position they have and the authority they have across the P&L, they've been in a big influential position with the C-suite for a long time. We're also seeing, you and I have talked about this, that CHROs in the last few years have been invited into that same game at a level of maybe authority and impact that they've never seen before. Talk to me a little bit about that and the CHROs and the HR leaders that are starting to feel that and maybe are reacting a little uncomfortably, like, oh my gosh, what if I can't stand up to the scrutiny? Or do you think this is going to go away? It's now, but is it forever? And I like it, but I don't want it to go away. Talk to the HR practitioner out there around kind of that opportunity that's theirs today inside of the world of business.
Yeah, look, great question actually, Jess, because having come to Phenom and really kind of seen a lot more insights into HR operations and just the function, I've
Yeah.
got a firm belief that HR in many, many ways is where finance was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, right? Where kind of getting funding for projects was not easy because it's considered to be back office, just like accounting was back in those days, right? Because
Yes.
it was all
Yes.
about P&L, things like that. Kind of had this perception of being a low value add kind of a thing, right? But finance, we were forced to become more than that. And the reason we became forced to do more than that is because the landscape changed, right? It was no longer about, hey, can I kind of basically manage costs, kind of basically tweak a bit more of margin out. The game really became about managing financial capital and deploying financial capital in the way that would kind of give the biggest payoff to the business in terms of strategic, or excuse me, in terms of enterprise value. So you think about that role from that accounting back office type of a role to becoming much more strategic around trying to thinking about how to create value for the business, right? So look, if I'm now responsible for deploying financial capital, my job is to what? Go acquire it, deploy it, and then make sure that I get an adequate return on it, right? That's exactly where HR is today, right? Because if you think about what you're doing, is you've got to go acquire human capital, deploy it in the right way, and get an ROI on it. And I do think that's kind of how the world is shaping up. Because if we do all those things right from a people perspective, enterprise value will follow, right? So
Yeah.
I think HR practitioners have this huge opportunity ahead of them if they can kind of seize that strategic nature of what's being served up to them and kind
Yeah.
of learn how to deal with that.
And I don't you think it's also because data is more, it's more at your fingertips than ever before. It's more accurate than ever before, especially when automation and AI can empower you to tell the human story, like
Mm,
finance has been able to tell that P&L story for years and years. And so being able to take that and then relate it back down into the financial outcomes of the organization is a key skill set that HR leaders need to have today, especially if they want to build great alliances with the CFO, because now the CFO isn't putting them in the position of, well, they love their people, but they really don't know the business, right?
yep,
It's they love the people, they're invested in those people. I love the people too, because I built those higher level soft skills in my role. And we are talking the same language, and their data is secure, it's stable, it's steady, it's predictable. That I think is where the partnership between the CHRO and the CFO can really, I think, probably put some jet fuel in the engines of any company. So a CEO isn't left flat footed in making their decisions around where or what corner they need to go around, right?
absolutely,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
Well, that I think that's the big challenge today. Is part of it is the partnership between those two, CHRO and CFO. That's probably one of the big takeaways is that there's more opportunity there now than ever before. And when you take a hold of that opportunity, the ability for the company to excel is enhanced in a pretty significant way.
No, I think that really does hit the nail on the head, and just to kind of again pull the thread that you were, I think, talking about a moment ago, Jeff, which is, this partnership between the CHRO and the CFO, can be really powerful because, look, I think, again, if the days of like distinguishing yourself as a company through deployment of financial capital is now kind of like behind us, right? It's really going to be around deploying your human capital that'll make the
Yeah,
difference, right? But yet, if you think about funding for that, it's done in like any other, or it's done the same way it is for any other project, which is around a business case, right? And I think that that's a place where CHROs and CFOs can really partner together, is on like building the business case around what needs to happen for the business for it to thrive. And most CFOs, I would say, they kind of instinctively know what's needed, but they've got to have the business case to be able to convince the CEO, maybe other C-suite members who may be also asking for,
yep,
kind of investment as well. Because at the end of the day, there's always going to be a scarcity of funding to like, do everything you want to do. You got to stack rank, what you're going to do. And the best way to stack rank them is to basically say what's the ROI, because that's what we should be doing, right?
yeah.
So I think that's kind of the the challenge, if you will, behind the opportunity is like, can you really kind of step up and kind of like start delivering those business cases that stand up to
Yeah.
scrutiny and
Yeah.
win out.
Well, Davinder, I'm certain that we could talk for another couple hours, not only on leadership, but also how all that applies back to talent. And we're coming to an end on our time. But what I love to do is when I have leaders on Smarter, I love to put them on the spot. I've got what I call the three questions, and there are questions that are about leadership. Could be about a book or a quote that's impactful to you, or someone who's made an impact on you, or a leadership trait that's important. So I'm going to ask you pick question one, two, or three. You don't know which one you're going to get, and I want you to respond real time for our listeners.
Sounds good.
All right, question one, two, or three. Which one do you want today?
I was gonna say I can probably actually, as I'm looking through these, right, I've probably got a concept that underlies all of them. How about I kind of do this a little bit unorthodoxly, kind of give you something that I think may actually hit most of these, or if not
I
all three
wouldn't
of them.
expect anything but that from you. So,
All right. Well, I'm glad I'm living up to expectations here. So here, how just sometimes, in life you kind of go through and you get, kind of you get this awareness of something. Maybe it's a new concept, a new idea, and then after that, realization, you begin to notice things everywhere, right? And I was
yeah,
pausing because, really, what I'm about to say is, this is exactly what happened. So a few years ago, the big aha moment for me was that, I'd always thought about business as being kind of like hard skills, right? Whether it's finance or operations or marketing or HR, right? All these kinds of things. And I would have thought, like to be better at business, I've just got to learn more of these skills or have more theory behind me. The big aha moment, though, was that none of that really matters at some point, right? You got to have that as a foundation. But what really makes a difference between, I think, great leaders, great businesses, great enterprises, or mediocre ones is actually anthropology, believe it or not, in my mind, right? So if you apply
I'm listening.
if you
Yeah, it's
apply an
great.
anthropological, kind of a mindset to business situations, it is truly transformational, right? And the way I came across this is I was doing a course at Wharton in an executive program, and I went there thinking, great, I already kind of have a pretty good sense of finance, but I'm gonna learn about marketing and sales and all that kind of stuff, right? And everyone they brought in was an anthropologist. Not a single one of them was actually a business person at all.
Hmm.
But what you realize though is that cultural anthropology is all about how do people interact with each other, right? And the danger is when you kind of do it by the book, you kind of lose sight of who we are as people. You kind of lose sight of kind of what drives people from the gut. And if you can dial into that, it just makes things, I think again, it just transforms things in a way that is hard to really, describe. So once I kind of had that realization, what I realized is that I'd read the Financial Times. I've been reading that for like I don't know 2 decades at this point. But there's an editor, the U.S. editor, Gillian Tett. So she's actually an anthropologist. I realized that hadn't really occurred to me before this, this course, but she's actually an anthropologist who writes extensively about bridging finance and anthropology together, right? There's a bunch of books, that have been written around, the same idea, if you will. And then as I kind of started going through my own past and thinking about leaders that I thought really had a big impact on me, what they did differently, it came down to the fact that they were really clued in on the kind of people side of it, if you will. We began the conversation by talking about love and things like that, right?
Yeah.
These are all kind of cultural, anthropological kind of things, I think, that ultimately have a big impact on who we are as a leader. And I would say that that's kind of the biggest thing that has really transformed me from being kind of that, if you will, by the book leader to being a much more on the fly, more kind of informal, if you will, and less structured leader. But people have been responding well to that. I've been able to build some great teams around, finance certainly, but even beyond that. And we talked about people kind of giving that extra mile.
Yeah.
It happens, when you do that the right way.
Yeah, and I think that that kind of more casual kind of leader. I also think about flexibility, nimbleness, and that whole concept of when we're nimble, we're closer to life and vitality. When we're rigid, we're closer to death and being easily broken. And I
Yeah.
hear you saying that over the last few years of your career, rather than becoming more rigid in the things you became great at, you actually went out, challenged yourself to learn something new, and got this new complete paradigm of taking a look at people in the whole life cycle and story of us, right? And applying that every day to the hard skills that you've earned, right? And that is a powerful way of ending our talk today. And again, congratulations for the great recognition in the great city of Philadelphia and the work that you've done over the years. I think so much of it is because you are this lifelong learner that we've been able to get to know a little bit better today with a lot of just amazing motivation. So, Davinder, thank you so much for joining us on Smarter. And I definitely think we all got smarter together today.
Thank you, Jeff. It was a pleasure, and I really enjoyed the time here with you. Talk to you soon.
Take care. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining me and Davinder to get a CFO's perspective on leadership. A couple of things I wanted you to just take away if you were able to listen to the whole podcast. These are some things that I thought were important. Number one is I love the idea that as a senior leader and even as a finance senior leader, it is about perseverance. That in a world of constant and continuous change, Davinder tells a story of how he was at a PwC getting bagels for the team when he was just learning, and how he had to persevere through that opportunity to get to those next level up opportunities. But even today, as he's managing large P&Ls and a global corporation, he still thinks that perseverance is a critical skill, especially in a world of consistent and constant change. I think the other thing that I heard him say is play chess, not checkers. So you have to be strategic, but the strategic idea isn't just a bottom line idea for the CFO anymore. It's the people focus as well. So it's keeping the people focus and the bottom line focus in mind every single day, playing chess, not playing checkers, really helping an organization think about where they're going and how to get around the next corner. So I thought that was a really important idea, especially from a CFO's position, is that Davinder is a people-centric CFO and also bottom-line CFO. It's a both and. I also love the idea of a CFO. He talked about being a storyteller, that when you have a strategy, when you have a goal, tell the story, sell the story around an organization. Don't just demand it. And when you do, you build loyalty, you build followership. I thought it was a very important leadership trait for CFOs to think about, but leaders in general. And then finally, you got to hold on to the soft skills even when the pressure is on. Stay authentic to yourself. Communicate with your team on a regular basis. And then when you get into a situation where you're in a pressure cooker, what we found out is that when you build relational equity with your people and you ask for that extra mile, that really hard decision from a business standpoint, they're willing to give you that extra mile because it's their mile to give. I think these are valuable lessons in general, but really valuable lessons from a CFO. So thank you, Davinder, and thank you all for joining me on Smarter, where we can all get smarter together.